Photo Art History presents Stockport, 1967. The Day the Sky Fell. Before the wider story begins, we pause with the images and recollections gathered through Steve Morin's work. These are not distant records. They are fragments of memory, survivors, relatives, witnesses, rescuers, and those who carried the story forward. An ordinary Sunday morning. Stockport woke beneath grey skies and light rain. Families prepared breakfast. Churchgoers stepped out into wet streets. Children watched television. Newspapers were opened. Nothing suggested that history was already moving toward the town. That ordinariness is what makes the story so powerful. The disaster did not arrive into drama. It arrived into routine. Into kitchens, into streets, into Sunday morning. My God, he's coming down. Witnesses described the British Midland Argonaut emerging through the low cloud, far lower than expected. People looked upward from streets, homes, yards, and workplaces. At first, there was disbelief. Surely it would climb. Surely it would pass over. Surely the pilot had control. But then the truth became unavoidable. The aircraft was not simply flying low. It was coming down over Stockport. Impact at Hopes Carr. At around 10 minutes past 10, the aircraft struck the Hopes Carr area. The crash shattered the morning. Smoke rose above rooftops. Debris spread across the ravine and surrounding buildings. People who had been standing in ordinary streets suddenly found themselves at the edge of catastrophe. In only seconds, Stockport had changed. The town was no longer simply a place beneath a flight path. It had become the scene of one of Britain's most remembered air disasters. Courage inside chaos. Steve Morin's collected accounts reveal not only tragedy, but courage. Ordinary people moved towards smoke and wreckage. Police officers, firefighters, ambulance crews, hospital staff, and local residents acted with urgency and compassion. Some rescuers returned again and again, not knowing what they would find. Lynn Tandy later recalled conversations with her neighbor, a nurse who had attended and supported one of the surviving crew members from the accident. The nurse has since passed away, but her memory forms part of this human chain of remembrance. Investigation and answers. After the rescue came the questions. Investigators examined the aircraft, the wreckage, the flight path, the weather, witness statements, and technical evidence. Their task was to understand how a routine flight had ended above Stockport. Aviation history is written through difficult lessons. Every finding matters. Every detail matters. Because understanding tragedy is one way of protecting future lives. Memory never leaves. The disaster ended in minutes, but memory lasted a lifetime. Survivors remembered, relatives remembered, witnesses remembered, emergency workers remembered, and Stockport remembered. This opening narrative honors the human story behind the history. They introduce the voices, images, and recollections that bring the air crash to life, and they lead us now into the wider photo art history narrative. Stockport, 1967. The Day the Sky Fell. Sunday, the 4th of June, 1967, began like any other Sunday morning in Stockport. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the cobbles wet, the rooftops shining, and the town lying beneath a low ceiling of gray cloud. Across the hills and streets, smoke rose gently from chimneys. Church bells prepared to call people to worship. Families moved quietly through kitchens and sitting rooms, reading newspapers, boiling kettles, setting tables, and planning an ordinary day. But this would not be an ordinary day. Before the morning was over, an aircraft would fall from the sky above the town. 72 passengers and crew would lose their lives, and Stockport would be changed forever. This is not simply the story of an air crash. It is the story of a town caught suddenly in tragedy. It is the story of families waiting for loved ones who would never arrive. It is the story of witnesses who looked up and saw history descending through cloud. It is the story of courage, grief, duty, memory, and remembrance. Stockport, 1967. The Day the Sky Fell. A photo art history production. Researched, written, and narration by David A. Lawton, with contributions from Lynn Tandy. Stockport, on that Sunday in June, was waking slowly. The streets were damp from rain, the pavements glistened. The air carried the smell of wet stone, coal smoke, and breakfast fires. In terraced houses, curtains were drawn back, kettles boiled, cups were set on saucers. Children sat close to television screens, while parents folded newspapers and discussed the day ahead. Sunday had its own rhythm. It moved more gently than the working week. The mills, shops, and offices were quieter. Streets that usually carried weekday haste now carried churchgoers, newspaper boys, families with umbrellas, and the occasional car passing slowly over wet cobbles. It was a town between worlds, still shaped by industry, yet already entering the modern age. The old brick mills, railway arches, and chimney stacks stood beside new roads, new buildings, and the growing confidence of post-war Britain. Inside homes, nobody knew that this quiet domestic world was about to be interrupted. A father reading the paper could not know that he would soon be standing outside, looking upward. A child eating breakfast could not know that the sound of aircraft engines would be remembered for decades. A mother preparing Sunday lunch could not know that the name Stockport would soon be carried across Britain by radio, television, and newspaper headlines. Above the town, low cloud pressed down upon the hills. It was not violent weather. It was not dramatic weather. It was simply the kind of grey northern morning that people accepted without complaint. And perhaps that made what followed even more shocking. Because tragedy did not arrive into a scene of chaos. It arrived into peace. It came into kitchens, churches, streets, and sitting rooms. It came into the ordinary.
Manchester Airport, 1967.
The aircraft waiting there belonged to an earlier age of air travel. The British Midland Argonaut was not a jetliner of the New World. It was a large piston-engined aircraft, powered by propellers, carrying with it the sound and character of post-war aviation. To passengers, it represented travel, progress, and possibility. To crews, it was a machine of systems, procedures, and discipline. In the 1960s, flight had become familiar enough to feel ordinary, but still special enough to carry a sense of occasion. People dressed for travel. Families waved at airport barriers. Children watched the aircraft with wonder. The sound of engines starting across the apron was part of the theater of the age. Aviation promised distance conquered, time shortened, horizons opened. But no one boarding that aircraft could know that the flight would never reach its expected ending. No one stepping onto the stairs could know that within a short time, their journey would be remembered not for where it was going, but for where it came down. The crew prepared, as crews always prepare, with checklists, inspections, readings, and routine decisions. The passengers settled into seats, newspapers opened, conversations softened. The door closed. Outside, the weather remained gray and wet. Inside, the aircraft became a small world of its own. And beyond the airport, Stockport waited beneath the cloud, unaware that the lives of passengers, crew, witnesses, rescuers, and townspeople were already beginning to converge. On this morning, the roofs were wet and dark. Chimneys stood in rows, church spires rose through the drizzle. Mills, terraces, and yards stretched across the valley. In the distance, hills faded into mist. The town looked settled, solid, rooted. The aircraft above it looked distant, small, almost harmless. Yet somewhere within that gray sky, the line between routine and disaster had already begun to narrow. Aviation rarely fails in one simple instant. It is often a chain: weather, judgment, instruments, engines, height, time, chance. One link joins another. One concern becomes two. A routine flight becomes a developing emergency. In the cockpit, the language of flight was precise. Altitude, heading, power, fuel, approach. The crew worked within procedures designed to impose order on uncertainty. Pilots are trained to manage fear by refusing to obey it. They check, they confirm, they calculate, they act. But even training cannot create more height once height is gone. Even experience cannot restore time once time has been spent. Below, nobody yet understood that the morning was changing. A woman carrying shopping did not know. A police officer on duty did not know. A child by a window did not know. A town beneath wet rooftops did not know. But history was approaching through the cloud, and it was coming lower. That is what makes such tragedies so difficult to hold in the mind. A list of passengers is never just a list. It is a collection of unfinished lives. Each name belongs to someone loved, someone expected, someone remembered. On the flight deck, attention would have tightened. Pilots know the sound of their aircraft. They know its feel through the controls. They sense when performance does not match expectation. Small changes matter. A gauge, a vibration, a note in the engines, a rate of descent, a response that is slower than it should be. At first, concern may be contained within procedure. Then concern becomes urgency. Below, the first witnesses began to notice, not as one crowd, but separately. A man at work paused. Someone at a service station turned his head. A resident near Portwood looked up from the street. A child pointed toward the cloud. Aircraft were common enough, but this one seemed different. Too low, too large, too close. For a few seconds, the mind tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was normal. Perhaps it was turning. Perhaps the pilot knew exactly what he was doing. Surely it would climb. Surely it would pass. Surely the sky would keep it. But the aircraft did not climb. It continued toward Stockport, and across the town more and more people began to look up. The aircraft emerged beneath the low cloud, descending over the town with a presence that witnesses could scarcely believe. It was no longer a distant machine in the sky. It was close enough for people to see detail. The line of windows, the movement of propellers, the markings, the size of the fuselage against the rooftops. People watched from pavements, yards, roads, and windows. Some froze, some shouted, some ran. The human mind resisted the truth. It searched desperately for another explanation. but there was none. The aircraft was not merely flying low, it was coming down. And then came the words that captured the horror of the moment. "My God, he's coming down." Near streets and buildings, people instinctively understood they were witnessing something beyond their control. No one on the ground could help yet. No one could warn the passengers. No one could lift the aircraft back into the sky. They could only watch. That helplessness would remain with many of them for the rest of their lives. The aircraft passed over the familiar world of Stockport. Roofs, chimneys, walls, yards, factories, houses, ordinary streets where ordinary people had begun an ordinary Sunday. And ahead lay Hopes Carr. Within moments, the sound of engines would be replaced by impact. The calm of the morning would be broken, and Stockport would enter one of the darkest days in its history. The crash shattered the Sunday morning. A terrible sound rolled through the streets. Windows shook. People ran to doors and pavements. Smoke rose above the valley, dark against the gray sky. Those who had seen the descent now stood in shock. Those who had not seen it understood, from the sound and smoke, that something catastrophic had happened. Questions came at once. Was it an aircraft? Where had it come down? Were there survivors? Was anyone on the ground hurt? How many people were on board? No one knew. Everyone wanted answers, but answers would take time. The first response did not begin with official orders. It began with human instinct. People moved toward the smoke. Workers, residents, motorists, passers-by. Some climbed over rough ground. Some called out. Some tried to reach the wreckage. Some searched for any sign of life. They did not know what they would find. They only knew help might be needed. Soon, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Police cars, motorcycles, fire engines, and ambulances converged on the scene. Roads filled quickly. Crowds gathered. Officers tried to create order where only confusion existed. Fire crews faced smoke, heat, debris, and danger. Ambulance teams prepared for casualties. Every minute mattered. But even as the emergency response grew, the scale of the tragedy began to reveal itself. This was not a minor accident. It was not something Stockport could absorb quietly and move past by afternoon. This was a disaster that would reach into homes, hospitals, airports, police stations, churches, and newspapers. The town had been struck suddenly, and now the work of rescue, duty, and grief had begun. At Hopes Carr, ordinary citizens became the first responders before the emergency services could fully establish control. Some had witnessed the crash. Others had simply heard the sound and seen the smoke. They arrived without helmets, equipment, or certainty. They came because someone might still be alive. They came because turning away was impossible. Many later described their actions modestly. They said they only did what anyone would have done. But history knows that courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes courage is a person stepping forward when every instinct says step back. Sometimes courage is moving towards smoke because someone inside it may need you. As police arrived, they faced the immediate difficulty of access. Roads were becoming crowded. People were drawn toward the scene by concern, fear, curiosity, and shock. Emergency vehicles needed room. Firefighters needed routes. Ambulance crews needed space. In the middle of grief, order had to be created. Communication moved by radio, telephone, and messenger. There were no mobile phones, no digital incident maps, no instant national alerts. Information traveled in fragments. An aircraft has come down. There is smoke. Send fire crews. Send ambulances. Tell the hospitals. Notify the authorities. Around the scene, crowds stood behind police lines, faces pale with disbelief. Some watched in silence. Some cried. Some searched for news. Children held the hands of adults and sensed, even if they could not understand, that something terrible had entered the day. The town was no longer waking. It was mourning before it fully knew what it had lost. Local authorities faced difficult and practical questions. How many people were involved? How many had survived? Where should relatives go? How could the scene be secured? How could the dead be identified with dignity? Every decision carried human weight. Behind every procedure stood a family waiting for news. Across Britain, families were still expecting ordinary outcomes. A delay, perhaps, a changed arrival time, a minor inconvenience. No one expects the telephone call that divides life into before and after. No one is prepared for the knock on the door. No one is ready for official words spoken with care, because there is no gentle way to say them. In Stockport, churches and halls became places of quiet gathering. People brought tea, blankets, food, and whatever help they could offer. Some assisted emergency workers, some comforted neighbors. Some simply stood beside others, because presence itself can become an act of kindness. Disasters reveal the hidden structure of community. They show the threads that bind people together, often unseen until tested. By evening, the town had changed. The rain, the rooftops, the streets, and the stone buildings were still there, but the atmosphere was different. People spoke in lower voices. Radios carried updates. Newspapers prepared headlines. Stockport was becoming known across the country for reasons no town would ever choose. Yet, amid shock and loss, something else had also appeared. Duty, compassion, resilience. The town had been struck by tragedy, but it had not turned away from those who needed help. At the crash scene, every fragment mattered. Aircraft wreckage is not only wreckage to an investigator, it is evidence. A damaged component, a broken instrument, the position of debris, marks on the ground, records of communication, witness testimony, all become part of a larger picture. The work is patient, exact, unsparing. Witnesses were asked what they saw and heard. How low was the aircraft? What direction was it traveling? Did the engines sound unusual? Did anything fall before impact? Were there flames, smoke, a change in height? Memory under trauma is imperfect, but many imperfect memories can still help build truth. Aviation safety is built upon this difficult principle. Every tragedy must teach. Not because explanation removes grief, but because lessons written in pain may protect lives in the future. Procedures are refined, training is improved, equipment is examined, assumptions are challenged. The safest journeys of tomorrow often contain the lessons of yesterday's disasters. But answers cannot do everything. They cannot return passengers to families. They cannot erase what witnesses saw. They cannot restore an ordinary Sunday. They can explain the chain of events, but they cannot undo it. That is the sorrow at the heart of investigation. Truth matters, but truth does not heal all wounds. And so Stockport carried both things forward, the need to understand and the need to remember. One belonged to aviation history, the other belonged to the human heart. For those who saw the aircraft over Stockport, the image remained vivid. The sound of engines, the low cloud, the impossible height. The smoke rising after impact. Some spoke of it often, others rarely spoke at all. People carry trauma differently. Silence is sometimes not forgetting. It is simply the only way a person can continue. For the families of the 72 passengers and crew, remembrance was deeper than public history. Behind each number was a life. Behind each life, a family. Behind each family, a future altered forever. History may write the number 72, but love remembers names, voices, habits, laughter, gestures, and absence. Memorials matter because they hold memory in public view. They say to later generations, something happened here, and those who were lost were not anonymous. Flowers, services, prayers, moments of silence, photographs, inscriptions, all are ways of resisting forgetting. They are acts of respect. They are promises. Stockport continued to change. Buildings altered. Roads shifted. Families moved. The town entered new decades. Yet beneath the modern streets remained the memory of that Sunday morning in 1967. Places remember because people remember them. And stories keep those memories alive. The day the sky fell is therefore not only a story of loss, it is also a story of witness, courage, compassion, and legacy. A town saw tragedy descend from the clouds. A community responded. And generations later, the memory remains. A nation concerned. On Sunday, the 4th of June, 1967, Britain woke to an ordinary morning. Church bells rang across towns and villages. Newspapers arrived through letterboxes. Families prepared Sunday lunches, and holidaymakers expected loved ones to return from abroad. It seemed a normal day. But within hours, the Stockport Air Disaster would become a national story. Only one day earlier, another serious aircraft accident had already dominated headlines. Together, these two tragedies caused many people across Britain to ask an unsettling question. How safe was modern air travel? Flying had become part of a new Britain. Package holidays had transformed ordinary lives. Families who once could only dream of foreign travel were now flying to Spain, Majorca, and the Mediterranean. Charter airlines offered something extraordinary: sunshine, adventure, freedom. But fear now entered the conversation. Newspapers questioned maintenance standards. Television commentators debated oversight and regulation. Passengers waiting in airports suddenly looked differently at aircraft outside terminal windows. Questions multiplied. Were older aircraft still safe? Were independent airlines monitored closely enough? Could this happen again? For many people, the technical details meant little. What they saw were headlines: smoke, wreckage, and grief. The questions begin. At Hopes Carr, investigators stepped into devastation. To ordinary observers, the wreckage looked chaotic. Broken metal, collapsed buildings, scattered debris, smoke drifting upward. But investigators saw something entirely different. They saw evidence. Every twisted panel mattered. Every gauge, every cable, every engine component, every piece of metal became evidence. The aircraft itself had become a silent witness. Investigators intended to make it speak. British Midland Argonaut G-ALHG had departed Palma de Mallorca at 5 o'clock that morning. The aircraft carried holidaymakers returning from the Balearic Islands to Manchester. Approaching Manchester Airport, the pilots were vectored toward the instrument landing system. But something was wrong. The aircraft failed to establish properly on the extended runway centerline. The crew initiated an overshoot. The first landing attempt was abandoned. Normally, this was routine. Normally, it meant little. But on this day, events were beginning to unfold rapidly. Reconstructing the last minutes. During the second approach over Stockport, the number 3 and number 4 engines suddenly lost power. The number 4 propeller was feathered. The number 3 propeller continued windmilling. The aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. Altitude was disappearing. Stockport was directly below. At 10:09 a.m., the aircraft crashed at Hopes Carr near Stockport town center. Investigators later determined that the double engine failure had been caused by fuel starvation. Not because fuel was absent, but because fuel had not reached the engines that needed it. The Argonaut possessed 8 fuel tanks arranged in pairs. A cross-feed system allowed fuel from one pair to supply other engines when required. On paper, it appeared flexible, but investigators discovered a dangerous weakness. The selectors controlling these systems were difficult to operate and poorly positioned in the cockpit. More critically, indications of what had actually been selected were unclear. Under certain circumstances, fuel could be drawn from incorrect tanks. Those tanks could become exhausted. Engines could fail. A chain of small circumstances had aligned with devastating consequences. From tragedy came lessons. Cockpit design changed. Human factors gained increasing attention. Warnings became clearer. Controls became easier to understand. Modern aviation learned from loss. For investigators, the cause had been found. But for Stockport, memory would remain forever. The human story of Stockport, 1967, begins not with wreckage, but with names. Steve Morin's work sought to recover the people behind the disaster: the crew, the passengers, the families, the survivors, and those who waited for news that would change their lives forever. 72 people died, but they were never simply a number. They were parents and children, husbands and wives, friends, neighbors, workers, holidaymakers, and crew members doing their duty. The crew of the British Midland Argonaut carried the responsibility of the flight. Captain Trevor Beebe, aged 38, was pilot in command. A former Royal Air Force pilot, he was described as experienced and calm under pressure. He survived the crash with serious injuries and later gave evidence to the public inquiry. Lynn Tandy's conversation with her neighbor in Romilly was with the theater nurse at the hospital. She had no phone. The hospital sent a taxi for her to go in, and she treated the pilot. She said she was just about to leave her house to go to Sunday church service. First Officer Christopher Pollard, aged 26, was killed in the crash. So too was flight engineer Gerald Lloyd, aged 35, whose role placed him close to the technical heart of the aircraft's fuel and engine systems. Chief Steward Tony Taylor, aged 29, was remembered as cheerful and professional. Stewardess Janet Wilson, aged 24, survived with severe injuries. She later recalled helping passengers before impact. She never flew again. In these lives, we see the courage and vulnerability of those on board. Crew members trained for emergencies, but no training could remove the human cost of what happened over Stockport. Among the passengers were families returning from holidays in Majorca. The Shaw family from Leeds were remembered as quiet, hard-working people who had saved for their first foreign holiday. Edward and Gloria Shaw travelled with their children, Jeremy and Maxine. All 4 were killed. The Tomlinson family from Clown in Derbyshire were also lost together. Raymond and Phyllis Tomlinson and their children Anne and Michael never returned home. Their village mourned as one community. James and Eliza Booth of Stockport were returning from visiting family in Majorca. They died less than 2 miles from home. That detail remains almost unbearable. A journey of hundreds of miles had brought them back to the edge of their own town. We remember the 72 passengers and crew who lost their lives. We remember the families who waited. We remember the witnesses who carried the sight for a lifetime. We remember the police, fire crews, ambulance staff, hospital teams, volunteers, and ordinary citizens who stepped forward when their town needed them. Stockport, 1967. The day the sky fell. A town, a tragedy, a legacy. Produced by David A. Lawton for Photo Art History, with contributions from Lynn Tandy. Thank you for listening, and please, remember the 72.